Thank you very much, Sarah, and thank you everyone for the invitation to speak for the Responsible Raw Materials team. It's really exciting to be here online and sharing with you all. And yeah, very happy to get in touch with you after the talk or later on. You've got my details down there. Very happy to continue the discussion. So I'll be talking about harnessing natural processes and whether they're potentially a viable method to start looking at extracting critical elements out of mine waste. And that'll include a bit of discussion on the critical element cobalt. So here's a nice acid mine drainage. That color looks in some ways quite lovely, but it's not really there for a good reason. That's acid and metals leaking out of a mine near Zeehan. Mine was operated over 100 years ago, and you've still got that legacy there today. There's estimates there's over 700 metal-containing sites abandoned across the state of Tasmania alone. Tasmania is not Australia's biggest state. In fact, it's the smallest, and that gives you an idea of just the scale of some of the old and former mining issues across the country and indeed across the world. So to think a little bit about how and where our metals are coming from, we've got these choices of where we can try and get things, but it's often quite hard to figure out where supply chains are going for these critical metals. Often they come out of new mines. It's quite common, but least sustainable in the long term. Mine wastes, if you haven't seen Anita's talk from yesterday, please do. It's an excellent talk, and her group has worked on some many excellent things. Reason why it come out in the place, but it's a good place to be looking because it's already been mined. And for recycling, sort of trying to reverse manufacture almost, because you're trying to turn your computer or your car back into those raw materials to try and make something new. That's pretty hard, unfortunately. So there's 2 points to start with. It's often hard to see the choice for when you're an end user. We can't yet go and buy an electric car and confirm that the cobalt was actually sourced in an equitable fashion. There's alliances like Fair Cobalt Alliance, but doesn't quite come through to the end user just yet. And generally speaking, it's still easier to repurpose, produce new stuff than it is to repurpose old things. So how are critical elements concentrated initially? Often they don't form their own deposits. That's one of the challenges and why these companies that try and produce critical metals often have quite a hard time, because they're fairly small volumes, low concentrations, and they come with something else. So a lot of the markets are just based on, say, a market for germanium might be based on the market for zinc and sphalerite being a zinc ore. And you also have challenges. You want to look back and find historically how much critical metal there was. Well, good luck. The mining company only analysed 10 minerals, didn't analyse anything else. So you have to sort of go and pay to reanalyze all that old material. If it's still there, it might be lost long since. It's quite hard to do that. So often you're looking at a different major commodity, and you have to then try and find out where in those minor minerals the critical elements are hiding. And that's sort of the natural process, and that's more of that hydrothermal or magmatic ore formation when you've got things happening for ore formation deeper down in the crust. I'm looking a lot more at what's happening up at the surface. And so electric vehicles, a great graphic from Visual Capitalist. There's a lot more metals in general in them. And it's hard to say, as I mentioned before, whether it's always responsible. We want to get away from hydrocarbon fuels. You can see on the right from a field trip where you had some quite insane prices of fuel. That was an Australian dollars price of over $3 per litre for diesel. You can do the conversions if you have the time, but it's, there's a lot more metals required just to get those electric cars onto the road in the first place. It might seem like a better thing than just burning up fuel to make CO2, but you need to be sourcing every component, that lithium, that cobalt, the manganese again, the nickel, copper, graphite, and anything else that's in there. We want it to be sourced sustainably. Otherwise, there's not that much point going through this big transition for the greener future if that's not being greener for both the environment and for the people that are doing the producing. And there are natural surface ore deposits as well. So this is where I've started to get into my work. So you've got areas like alluvial gold. Gold panning is a surface ore deposit. Deposits of cobalt and nickel, particularly in tropical areas where you've got weathering that basically concentrates the metals in the surface. And you can also have things like iron absorption clays that can concentrate the rare earth elements. So there are processes naturally that can concentrate elements into the surface environment. And these are the kind of processes that I think we should be looking at a lot more, because they can teach us quite a lot about how we can process and reprocess mine wastes for producing materials. I won't go through that entire diagram because it's a little bit too busy, but the point of it there is you might be trying to produce a particular thing, in this case tellurium, you might want to be making a stream of tellurium nanoparticles or soluble tellurium to try and produce tellurium out of a waste or out of a rock. And you might be understanding the natural processes is a great way to find out what actually works in the environment already. Can we learn from what processes already work? Might be microbially driven or might be chemically driven. What actually can produce that in nature? And can we learn from what processes are most favorable to then actually go about producing that material? And weathering is natural. Rocks generally weather very slowly, and that geological time idea is quite hard to fathom at times. Like humans have only been around for a very small portion of the history of the Earth. And rocks have been weathering for much, much longer than we've ever been here. And we're just seeing that snapshot in geological time. What we need is critical metals, and we need them in a fairly quick time. So trying to understand what processes do concentrate metals, but also what ones can do it relatively quickly, or natural things we could just speed up a little, tweak the process, and get a supply of these critical metals in a slightly out of the box way. I'll talk a little bit about cobalt, which is the metal I've been working on quite a lot most recently. On the right here is an image of the confluence in a place called Queenstown, Tasmania. It's probably, as Nita mentioned in her talk yesterday, one of Australia's most infamous polluted sites. There's still remnants of acid from the former legacy that's owned by the Tasmanian state government coming down the river. And that's mixing with the fresher water and ending up in a lovely, or not so lovely, tailings delta out some 40 kilometers away. And there's big challenges there, looking at a solution long-term for cleaning up all that previous mining work. And one way which we might be looking at is to actually think, well, can we reprocess some of that and get some of these metals out of it? Because a lot in there, and they're just sitting there at the moment in an environment where they shouldn't be there in the first place. So for me, cobalt really is one of the archetype critical elements. It's a high demand for batteries, so that green transition. Supply issues were very well discussed yesterday in talks like Owens about the unequal geographic distribution and the challenges of getting a sustainable production line through from places like the DRC. There's many deposit types, so cobalt isn't always found in one place. There's sulfide hosted, there's arsenic hosted, there's oxide hosted. It's pretty difficult to process it out of ores, and there's a great review on that particular topic from a couple of years ago. And it might be found in places like these interesting boulders outcropping in the Northern Territory when I was on fieldwork a couple of years ago. And just a little bit of mineralogy. I don't want to go too far into this today, but it's an interesting element. It's got a couple of oxidation states, which just tells you how many electrons have been lost off the metal. It's actually biologically essential. So apart from potentially wanting it in your smart car or battery, it's actually all inside all of us in the form of vitamin B12. The vitamin has a component called cobalamin, cobalt from the cobalt. And the crustal abundance of cobalt is about 25 parts per million. So not a huge amount. It's one of the less common transition metals compared to something like iron, which is there in percent amounts in the crust. And most of its minerals are things with sulfur and arsenic. That's not a great thing because you're trying to produce cobalt from these sorts of deposits. You might get acidic kind of drainage, or an arsenic as a byproduct is not usually seen as a good thing. And it can also substitute for elements like iron and nickel. Interesting picture on the lower left is from synchrotron work. It's trying to chase around these minor metals can be quite hard. So zooming right in at a place called the synchrotron, we found that it really liked hanging out with manganese in the surface environments. So there's a potential double capture there of both cobalt and manganese, both which are critical metals across different parts of the world. So what I'm really interested in researching is cobalt cycling and mineral transformations. So here's a simplified diagram compared to the other one of some of those transformations that can occur. So you have a primary mineral, so-called as the initial stage mineral, often doesn't include oxygen, but not always. And that can dissolve, release cobalt as dissolved cobalt 2+. And that's it's got a lovely color when you do get it, although it's not necessarily a good thing because it's one of cobalt's more toxic forms. And that can form secondary cobalt minerals, which can then dissolve back, and you get this sort of dynamic cycling which can occur. Exactly how it occurs, no one's exactly sure. Microbes are probably involved in the surface environment. It might just be purely chemical. Those are also topics of great interest to me, and there's a lot more to learn about that to understand what really drives cobalt cycling around from solid to aqueous forms. And one of the things that would be really good is if we can produce a method that basically produces a stream of aqueous dissolved cobalt 2+ out of a mineral deposit, whether that's a waste rock facility or a tailings dam, and then use that and further reprocess it to produce cobalt out of a particular waste scenario. So that's one of the things I'm really interested in working on a lot more. Recently been working on cobalt nanoparticles and cobalt manganese together and the implications of cobalt cycling. So related to this, getting some of those building blocks in place to understand what cobalt does in the environment. So that's open access. So jump to that if you'd like to read it. And my current work is a part of a wider team at the University of Tasmania in something called the Regional Research Collaboration. And we're working on sustainable production of critical metals, focusing on Tasmania. We've got 3 parts, kind of trying to cover the entire value chain from unlocking those resources by characterizing the ores, producing in a sustainable fashion, and also education and engagement, really engaging with the local communities where the metals are produced. You can see a bit of a concentration of the west coast of Tasmania, which is a area where there's not that many people living actually, but lots of the mines are out there. There's only 2 high schools in that area of where the numbers 5 to 9 are for about up towards 10,000 people. It's not exactly it's a highly resourced area in terms of social resources, but it is in terms of meta resources. So a really interesting part of the state. And it's a great part of the country, and there's potentially really high value critical metal resources there that can be produced in a sustainable fashion. And that's one of the big projects that's going on currently in the codes department or geology department at the University of Tasmania. So future potential, I think we're clearly going to see more critical metals, but how we get them is one of the really important parts now. I think we've established that we need critical metals, but we haven't established the best ways to get them and have a what we describe as a truly ethical supply chain from the start to the finish. There's a lot more to learn about the environmental cycling, which is really where my research focus is, and hopefully then push that towards the processing side to devise pathways to concentrate metals for production. So thank you again for the invitation. Thank you to all my collaborators. And yes, please get in touch with me for any further questions. Very happy to continue the discussion.
Owen, absolutely fantastic. Thank you so, so much. Everybody, please put your hands together for the fabulous Owen. Brilliant. Thank you very much. Brilliant. Owen, we've got a number of questions that are coming in for you. And the first one, which I've just got to ask because it is brilliant and it's on topic geographically. This question comes in from Callum, and Callum asks, can cobalt be concentrated with yeast? I'm thinking of the B12 content of Vegemite. What do you reckon, Owen?
I really love that question, Callum. I hadn't put those 2 things together, and I wish I had. So thank you for thinking of that. I'll have to credit you with that one in the future because I kind of want to use it now. I actually maybe it could. There's I want to do more experiments with the microbial side of things. I've dabbled with it a little bit in my PhD with tellurium, but I haven't really got into it too much with cobalt yet, at least on the published side of things. Whether yeast could actually concentrate it, it's definitely possible. Bacteria. Something I think it's probably been more worked on than yeast in the environment or fungi, at least to my knowledge in terms of the metal relations in that sort of regolith or surface space, but yeast and fungi more generally equally should be part of that discussion, particularly in more of these wet temperate environments, which is something that Tasmania has plenty of. So I want to get back to that one.
Awesome. Thanks, Owen. See, we've got a whole new avenue that we can go diving into here. Fantastic. There's another question in from Ryan, and Ryan asks, can you think of projects around the world where people are doing excellent work reprocessing cobalt from tailings to clean up environmental liabilities? And then in brackets, we've been looking into this in the Canadian context and would love to know of others who do it well.
I think it's certainly an area where people are starting to look at it a lot more. I don't have any I don't know exactly the best projects around the world off the top of my head, but I know there's some of them going on. There's one in Australia that's looking at producing cobalt fresh, but from pyrite, but not producing sulfuric acid waste, which is really exciting as well, but that's not a waste one. So I think I'll come back to you on that one too, to sort of, I don't know, it's a perfect example off the top of my head of what best practice looks like. I think that we're getting closer to doing these sorts of things, but at the moment I won't sort of put a name there just in case.
That's a good answer. Nice one, Owen. Final question is really around the demand side for cobalt. So we've been hearing lots of examples of where, say, Tesla is engineering cobalt out of its batteries, for example. So the reduction in demand, and then of course the improvements in being able to process cobalt from nickel assets, for example, as well, of course, where it's occurring there naturally. Do you see, is there a price point that cobalt needs to be at in order to justify being able to extract it in the ways that you've been discussing here? Or do you think that actually the opportunity comes in the cleanup side of things? Where do you think that balancing act sits, Owen?
I think there probably is a price point for most of these critical metals, and that has been seen recently. If anyone's been following the Australian news, nickel dropped below that sort of critical price point that would have kept it being a sustainable thing. That was partly due to a supply of the flood from relatively cheaper places of production like Indonesia, and then many of the Australian nickel producers have shut down. So it's all gone into care and maintenance more correctly at the moment. So I think there is a critical price point. Yet I haven't exactly tracked the cobalt price lately, but it does need to be a certain level, as it does for almost every metal, to be able to produce something in a routine kind of way. So I think it does need to be at a certain level before you can say, you have to be producing something of like cobalt. And I think we've seen that the critical metal prices are unfortunately more volatile than some of the other more long-term major volume trade commodities. That has been one of the things that's really been challenging to actually produce them, because the values do go up and down. A couple of years ago, nickel soared when people thought cobalt's too expensive, so we'll go for nickel, and now nickel's come back to earth again. So that has gone up and down. And the example given of Tesla engineering cobalt out, that'll mean something else that will go up. It won't necessarily mean that there'll be no change in supply and demand overall. So that side of the logistics and dynamics, I think, is really important to understand. And you may see governments in some places trying to sort of underwrite some of these projects to keep them going. It's definitely a possible thing to actually produce that innovation, because somewhere the investment has to come to actually go through these kinds of projects and put the money in that they deserve. And I think on the second part of the question, that yes, there is a potential. You might have more incentive to pay using a cleanup fund to produce something, and there's a relative cost that's paid back over time. So that would be one way of doing these kind of cleanup operations. If there's a product that can be produced, all the better, compared to just cleaning it up in some sense. And where does it even go? At any rate, you still need to find a place to store the clean material as well, which is probably a secondary challenge isn't discussed heaps either.
Yeah, loads of those unintended consequences, aren't there, across the piece. So with that, thank you so much, Owen. Everyone, please put your hands together for the fabulous Owen. Thank you very much, mate. That's great.
Thank you.
Excellent.